A legal setback for the Trump administration as a U.S. judge blocks efforts to cut Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. On Monday, a U.S. federal judge blocked the Trump administration's attempt to deny Medicaid funds to Planned Parenthood, a nonprofit organization that provides reproductive health care services. The ruling requires the government to continue federal reimbursements, which help low-income Americans access medical care. This comes as President Donald Trump faces mounting domestic pressure in a number of areas, ranging from low approval ratings and immigration controversies to economic concerns. Just over 6 months into his second term, how is Trump faring? Good question. To discuss this and much more, let's bring in our guest. Here in Washington, D.C., Imani is a cultural curator and professor of digital storytelling at the George Washington University. From our newsroom, Rina Shah is a political analyst and commentator. Otaviano Canuto is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a former vice president of the World Bank. And Brandon Bryce is a columnist and secretary of the Delaware Republican Party. And Brandon, why don't I start with you? And let's start with some of these polls we've been looking at. A recent Gallup poll, which was conducted between July 7th to the 21st, shows Trump's approval rating kind of dropping dramatically. It's down to 37%. That's down 10 percentage points from when he took office. What's your take on that?
Well, no one's popular when it's time to be the grown person in the room. You know, one of the things is that if you look at what he's doing, this is the president that came again and said, promises made, promises kept. Everything the president said he was going to do, he's doing. Here's the issue, though. The challenge is now conservatives, not Democrats, are saying, well, wait a minute. This is not, you know, some of the big, beautiful bill, it's actually raising taxes, not lowering taxes. And so I think what's happening is there are conservatives that are either with Trump, and then there are those that have said, hey, we supported you, but this bill and this policy is actually what Republicans are fighting against, not what they're fighting for. What gives?
Rina, we are seeing some slippage among Republicans in this poll. According to the poll, 89%, though, still approve of what the president is doing. The more important numbers, the independents, 29% approve of his handling of the presidency so far. That's a 17-point drop. What's your take on these numbers?
In terms of the numbers, I think anything is possible. We see presidential approval ratings ebb and flow, given circumstances, whether internationally, domestically. I think domestically is what we saw a big focus on with the passage of the big, beautiful bill. And the coverage around the July 4th holiday really dominated how many Americans started to see what this bill was really about. It was a high-risk bet from the jump. You know, I think when you looked at how it cut taxes by $1.6 trillion, but it slashed spending as well, you saw that it was sold as an economic boost. But the Fed is warning of inflation spikes. We might see one come September. And while if fuels growth, or so Republicans say it's going to fuel economic growth, there are just a lot of people who have focused on the debt. How this big, beautiful bill drives up the national deficit, I think, was one of the most problematic things for the Republicans. And they haven't been able to message really out of that boondoggle. Democrats had an entryway there, and we haven't really seen them grab the mantle there. So again, going back to my original point, I think anything is possible. If Trump is really continuing to do well on the international front, then sometimes the domestic woes, again, related to what happened on Capitol Hill earlier this month, kind of get swept under the rug. But I wouldn't really take a bet on that.
Imani, Rina makes a good point. Numbers ebb and flow. And she also said there's kind of an opening for Democrats, but they can't be very heartened by what they're seeing in this Wall Street Journal poll that just came out. It shows a 63% disapproval rating of the Democratic Party. Those numbers jump off the page because this is the highest among voters in 3 decades. So the Republicans not doing so well when it comes to Donald Trump's numbers, but Democrats not faring much better.
No, they're not. And what I think we're really seeing, as Rina just mentioned, with the ebb and flow, we're seeing that the ebb for Democrats is bleak. There have been numerous opportunities over the last 6.5 months for Democrats to really surge in ways in which for their opposition. What is it exactly that the Democratic Party stands for not what they stand against. And what we're seeing so much is it's constant. This is what happened with the 2024 election. Everything was in opposition to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, but we really didn't see exactly, steadfast, clearly what the Democratic Party stood for. And now here we are, 6.5 months into this second term, and they're not able to capitalize on the chaos.
And why is that, do you think? Because Rina and Brandon both point to this big, beautiful bill. They say that there are problems there in terms of selling that to the constituents. Democrats should have an opening, and yet, as you point out, they're struggling.
They're struggling because we still have not seen any sort of cohesive unity, any singular issue. It should have been everything from the genocide in Gaza. It could have been everything from, the fact that women's reproductive rights are constantly under attack. It could have been everything from the way in which we've seen the Supreme Court rule over the last several weeks. And not at any given point have we seen unity in the Democratic Party. And that's what's going to take us into the midterms. You have to have a unified voice. You have to have a unified platform. And right now, we're not seeing that.
Otaviano, we've seen a lot of photo ops. Just 4 days ago, the President of the United States went over to look at the Federal Reserve building that's under construction. There's renovations taking place, and kind of criticized the chair, Jerome Powell. This was kind of got a lot of, I guess you would call it clickbait. There's a lot of controversy about this as the two kind of clashed about numbers. What was your take when you watched it?
I think it is not very much consequential because the damage that might take place with respect to financial markets and risk premium if a more aggressive concrete attitude were taken with respect to Mr. Powell would not compensate. And that's why Mr. Trump himself has already hinted that he would not push too far the envelope. And the fact of the matter is that it's going to get a little bit more, hotter in the next few days, because I believe that the meeting of the Fed, the FONC, this week will maintain the interest rates where they are, even if one or two governors push for a reduction of the basic interest rates. The fact of the matter is that it makes sense that the Federal Reserve Bank waits until the effects of the tariffs on inflation are clear enough so as to take a decision. So I'm among those who believe that ultimately we're going to have the maintenance of the current interest rate, and therefore probably additional references and pressure coming from President Trump, but with no major consequence.
He did appoint Jay Powell back in 2018, but there's been a lot of saber rattling. He's grumbled about him, and as you pointed out, he's been pushing him to lower interest rates and has even suggested at times that he might fire him. North Carolina Republican Senator Thom Tillis recently weighed in on this. I want to play some sound from him, and I want to get your thoughts on the other side.
Okay.
The consequence of firing a Fed chair just because political people don't agree with that economic decision will be to undermine the credibility of the United States going forward. And I would argue if it happens, you're going to see a pretty immediate response. And we've got to avoid that.
So he's sounding the alarm there. You feel as though Powell's safe, but what about his thoughts? And we are hearing from some people concerns about this.
Well, I would say that the Fed has to do what it's supposed to do. It has an inflation targeting regime. There is consistency between, on the one hand, the evolution of the targets in terms of inflation and the monetary policy decisions that the Federal Reserve Bank has taken. So the independence of the Fed is essential for the credibility of its policies and the corresponding results. So I think things have to be as they are.
Well, Brandon, Trump's been taking this tough stance on immigration. That was kind of a hallmark when he ran for office, as you pointed out. One of the things he, of course, illustrated that he was going to talk about. There's this new detention center that's been set up in Florida. It's nicknamed Alligator Alcatraz. One of the most talked about cases, though, involves a Maryland man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He was wrongly deported to El Salvador. Here's what the legal director of CASA, that's a immigrant rights nonprofit, had to say about that case.
But what is happening to Kilmer is all part of Trump and the administration's bigger strategy to erase black and brown people from this country and inch us closer and closer to white supremacy.
Pretty strong words there. I wanted to get your thoughts.
Well, first of all, someone actually did escape the real Alcatraz, so it's not near. Nothing is 100% not escapable. But here's the thing with immigration, and this is a very sensitive thing. I would have thought that the president, whose wife is an immigrant, would have been a champion for immigrant policies, or at least actually doing something. The problem with immigration is not so much we need something new. We need to actually act what's on the books and make the visa process easier and much better. And we have not done that, both sides, Democrats and Republicans. But here's the other thing with immigration. I think the president has to be very careful on this issue. Let's go back 15 years, Prop 187 in California. It's the reason California has had a supermajority Democrat presence in California, because that Prop 187, which impacted immigrants in states like California, could have a devastating impact on other states like Texas, like Florida. And so I think immigration is one of those things that has to be sensitive to this president, not only just for his own policies, but for other Republican candidates Republican members in the House and Senate who rely on those votes. When you look at most people, black and brown, who are typically conservative, many of them are immigrants, strong Catholic presence. So when you think about this issue, I think immigration is one of those things that the president, if he's not careful, can literally cost him, not cost him, but cost Republicans in the next upcoming election.
Well, how would he dial it back? I mean, how would he thread the needle? Because this is where his base really kind of weighed in. This is an issue they feel strongly about. Brandon? Well, let me ask that question of Rina, because we're having problems with Brandon there. What are your thoughts on this? Because this was kind of an issue that the base resonated on.
With immigration, I think what you're seeing right now with Trump is a win. I think the vast majority of Americans see action, and action in the form of more physical bodies going to take action towards people that are either here illegally or are doing all these things that the Trump administration talks about today, what Trump talked about on the campaign trail. And what I'm talking about is migrants who have committed crimes. Now, if you look at the data, you know that the vast majority of immigrants here who are within these United States are law-abiding citizens. But what has come into debate, really, and the sharp focus here is that for years we had lawmakers here on Capitol Hill tell us that they wanted to undertake comprehensive immigration reform. Nobody did it. So we have this broken system. And in this system, we have seen visa overstays be a big part of why we have people here illegally. And it felt like no presidential administration wanted to tackle this head on. When you hear Trump supporters talk about what they like about Trump is that he is unabashed in his support of going out there and showing a very strong stance, even if that means getting some of the wrong people caught up in the wheels of this. Now, the courts here are helping Trump. And one thing that I'm willing to bet a large sum of money on is that most Americans do not know that immigration judges fall under the purview of the executive branch. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that most immigration judges are handing wins to the Trump administration because they are essentially led by the Trump administration. So when it comes to fairness and justice and how people here are seen as being here lawfully or unlawfully, you're just seeing a lot of action right now. And yes, there are going to be dark and consequences and and actions taken up by this administration as all this is happening, because this is really a shock to the American consciousness. But so many Americans want this. I'm just willing to also bet that many of them are unwilling to admit it when asked in public polling, whether they like it or not. But at the end of the day, what I am concerned about is civil rights and people who are unfairly targeted, likely because of skin color or being seen as part of one subgroup or another. That is, again, an unintended consequence of how immigration, that the great amount of action we're seeing out of this administration gets played out.
Well, Imani, to that point, it's worth noting that in the Kilmar case, he was released from jail Wednesday. He's also got a temporary block on efforts to deport him again. And as Rina was saying, you know, these judges actually may go in favor of Trump, but the federal judges are going in the opposite direction. A federal judge dismissed a suit the administration lodged against Chicago and the state of Illinois, saying that they were interfering with this crackdown. A federal judge also decided to keep in place an injunction nationwide that blocks Trump's executive order limiting birthright citizenship. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I just also want to point out, you know, to my colleagues this evening that I think it's really important when we're talking about someone like a Mr. Abrego Garcia, that, you know, yes, he might have been quote unquote wrongfully deported at one point, but then we also saw that the Justice Department was filing charges of sex trafficking. And on the topic of sex trafficking, I think that's also really an important moment of hypocrisy and irony for the Trump administration, considering the fact that the same Justice Department does not want to release the Epstein files. And that, you know, we have Donald Trump talking quite flippantly about the way he wants to potentially pardon some of Jeffrey Epstein's colleagues, who we also know were complicit in a series of incredibly heinous crimes. So what I make of current federal judges providing some sort of blockage, some sort of check and balance, which is what we're not seeing very much of, I think it's incredibly important, especially when it comes to something like birthright citizenship. But I do think that we should be all paying attention, and I mean all as in all citizens, everyone here who are paying attention right now to the way in which the Trump administration, the hypocrisy when it comes to, you know, who is considered a criminal and who isn't.
All right, we'll get to the Epstein files in just a minute. You kind of jumped the gun. There's a couple questions ahead, but let me ask you about this federal judge blocking the Trump administration from cutting funding to all Planned Parenthood affiliates. Imani, what kind of a difference is that going to make for communities, do you think?
Oh, it's going to be huge. I think for most people, and one of the things that I've always felt with Planned Parenthood is that they just don't have the best public relations team, because somehow they have been identified solely for the fact that they are a provider of abortion care, and for, you know, their women's reproductive health rights and the choices of women to decide what they do and want to do with their bodies, in particular around pregnancies. And so I think it's really, really important, and this is very, very significant, because Planned Parenthood, for thousands of communities, literally millions of people in this country rely on Planned Parenthood, from everything from cancer screenings to really just general health screenings. And so it's really important that they're still able at this moment to receive the funding that they currently were due, because it provides life-saving medical care for millions of Americans.
And Rina, what kind of a blow is this for the administration? Because after all, Trump was the one who selected the justices who ended up on the Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade.
Well, the Trump administration has had a lot of wins from this Supreme Court, so I don't know that they're taking this one so personally. And also, think about it, for conservatives, getting Roe versus Wade overturned was sort of the big goal, and they got what they wanted there. Now, chipping away at Planned Parenthood, I don't think it's a really smart strategy. I don't think they should lean in anymore, and this is what I'm talking about, the Republicans here, because essentially Planned Parenthood is just a bad name, because what they do provide, as my co-panelist was just saying, is they provide life-saving reproductive care, particularly in rural communities, places like where I grew up, southern West Virginia, where there's already a lack of medical professionals, an adequate amount of healthcare professionals to address the community's needs. And so for women who need a simple gynecological exam, or looking to have a cervical cancer screening, or need some kind of vaccination, for example, against HPV for a girl in her teens. These are all things that you can get when you have access to reproductive care. And that goes beyond terminating an unintended pregnancy. So making sure these places are funded with federal dollars is important. And I think, again, if they talk to their voters, Republicans, they will find by and large that a number of their voters also do access Planned Parenthood clinics for things other than a termination of an unintended pregnancy or otherwise.
Brandon, it's about 19 minutes into the program. We're getting to the Epstein files. Any other program in the United States, it would have been in the first 9 seconds. As you know, it's a huge topic, especially with his base. He's allegedly mentioned in the files, which have not been released. Some Republicans actually joined Democrats in saying, release him, get him out there, transparency. This is what Republican Senator Thom Tillis had to say about it. Let's listen to what he had to say.
At the end of the day, we got to get back on what we're doing to help the American people and get distractions off the table. And I doubt seriously, in spite of the fact that the House went home, that you are going to forget about this between now and Labor Day. So the best way to deal with this is to release the file and let the facts speak for themselves.
Brandon, how do you feel about this?
Well, first of all, the world needs to know who's on that list. And today, I just heard that now Ghislaine Maxwell actually is now admitting and openly giving 100 names to the Department of Justice. Here's the reality. Epstein was a socialite. Doesn't make it right, but this is the reality. All the president has to say is literally, hey, this is a guy who I knew. Was he there? That's the question. But I can tell you, the more that the president, if he is on that list, runs from that list, the worse off now the press starts digging. And this is what the media wants. The reality is, if you're going to expose Donald Trump, then you got to expose Bill Clinton and all the other folks who was on that list. And I think that the president, I think it's not good for the president, if he's on that list, to hold back. Release it, be honest, be transparent, say you knew the guy, but I wasn't there.
This is what the media wants, you say, but this is also what MAGA wants, right?
Well, the reality, maybe it is, maybe it's not. It goes back to, again, who was Jeffrey Epstein? This guy was a socialite. He dealt with many people on both sides. And so this shouldn't be what's becoming is, oh, it's an anti-Trump push. The reality, this guy worked with both Democrats and he worked with Republicans. And I find it interesting, again, that the focus is on the president, but it's not talking about the other presidents or the other world leaders that may or may not be on that list. So again, if you're the president, be transparent, be honest, hurry up and put it to bed, because if he doesn't, I can tell you these are the things that unfortunately make or break president.
This is an interesting issue because there is no actual list. There was no notebook with a bunch of names written. There was an affidavit in which victims of Jeffrey Epstein, a sexual criminal, not just an offender, a criminal who had a co-conspirator who was sitting behind bars, Ghislaine Maxwell. These two criminals victimized, they trafficked these young women from really disadvantaged, poor backgrounds. They were underage, so many of them. They took them to an island. They took them to parties with wealthy, elite individuals. Now, these women have named some of these men, and maybe there are women on this list as well. But in this affidavit is where this quote-unquote list sits. If the Trump administration is truly dedicated to being accountable and transparent, they will explain this in a better way. But right now, what's getting lost is the hundreds of lives of young, innocent, poor women who were trafficked by these two criminals. I personally think Ghislaine Maxwell should have her U.S. naturalized citizenship revoked. She's also a citizen of the UK as well as of France, and so British citizenship, and she needs to be deported. This is an awful human being who right now is exploiting our U.S. justice system. She's appealing to our Supreme Court for some degree of clemency, and she's vis-a-vis asking for a pardon from Trump. This is somebody that needs to be kicked out of the country. She and Jeffrey Epstein were monsters, and the victims on their list have named a bunch of names, and they're all in that affidavit. What Ghislaine Maxwell can offer up is no different what is sitting in a sealed affidavit right now, and it should be revealed to the American public. We deserve to know.
And Imani, she brought up Maxwell, you did as well. Trump was asked about her and whether or not he would be open to a pardon, that sort of thing. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Would you consider a pardon or a commutation for Ghislaine Maxwell if she cooperated?
It's something I haven't thought about. It's really something. It's something I'm allowed to do it, but it's something I have not thought about.
Imani, I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say and her role in all of this.
Well, I think as Rina just said, I mean, these are criminals, her and any of her conspirators. I think it's really important, you know, the way in which what President Trump likes to do very, very well is play with rhetoric. He likes to throw around, you know, these statements. I've never heard of this. I've never heard of Project 2025. I have no idea who this person is, and we know that that's just falsehoods. They are lies. We know that at any given point, he's going to do exactly what he can do to preserve his own protection. But I think the reason why we are talking about this is because he is the president of the United States. We're not talking about Bill Clinton. We're not talking about anybody else who's on that list right now, because they are not currently sitting in the White House. Let's talk about who's here right now. Let's talk about people who were in the White House 20 plus years ago. I would like to hear and see what the Justice Department has. I think many Americans, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of where they fall on any sort of political spectrum, are curious about what actually went down. And of course, as Rina also mentioned, the victims, we lose sight of them. So I think it's really interesting that he'll play coy right now, and then we'll see coming up, whether it be him or his press secretary, how they'll spin this in the coming days.
All right, and Otaviano, before we leave, I want to ask you, he's also been hyper-focused on tariffs and trade deals. How's this going to impact the U.S. consumer and the economy?
Fact of the matter is that the effect of the tariffs are not still fully on. The companies, U.S. companies, have absorbed a bit the impact of the costs of higher tariffs. Among other reasons, because there was a lot of inventory accumulated prior to now. But we have a pattern that is becoming clear along those, trade agreements have been announced already with Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, United Kingdom, Japan, yesterday European Union. And they all point out to higher tariffs into the U.S. market. So this will probably have an effect on domestic price. We don't know exactly whether this will be a one-shot or whether it will instill higher levels of inflation. I need to say something as well on two issues before that I have the time. See, the U.S. immigration shift may have profound economic consequences. One has to take into account that the immigration has accounted for the majority of the U.S. labor supply growth over the last decade. And so some sectors are strongly reliant on immigrant labor in construction.
It's a good point, and I apologize. We've run out of time. I wish we could talk to you more. We'll have you back on the show, and we can talk about these issues. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching another edition of The Heat.